In this meeting, we got to fuse the energy of all of our movement. God says have a meeting. In other words, come together and focus again on my purposes. And God says if you come together and have a meeting, then I'll guide you and I'll lead you. The prophets had a meeting. We need a meeting. The first Reconstruction, there was a meeting. Changed this nation. Second Reconstruction, Civil Rights Movement was a meeting. Changed this nation. We need a third Reconstruction. We need a third awakening, a third national revival. We need a meeting of the heart and a meeting of the mind. We need a revolution of values meeting. We need a meeting where something can start running from heart to heart and from breast to breast. I know together we can heal this nation. Together we can ensure that all children are respected. Together, we can redeem the heart of America and make sure that this nation lives out its promise. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Together. Gracious, eternal God, we thank you for your presence, for being Emmanuel, God with us. Hold us and help us, mold us and make us, that we might together, as your people, who serve one Lord, do your will. Amen. Amen. It is good to be here tonight with all of my brothers and sisters of many faiths, but especially my Jewish brothers and sisters, because we have to do some work now, y'all. We need every clergy person, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, that would be willing to sign up your congregation to say you will get 100% of your congressmen, encourage them to register to vote and go vote. We need you to sign up on the line. And if you can, we need you to go to the website, click on the donate button, and donate your own free will and accord, resources. I often say if mean folk have money, moral folk need some money. But we need some resources to help raise up persons that can work in the field during this critical year and beyond. I want to talk about the danger of America misdiagnosing terrorism, violence, injustice necessitates a moral revival. Tell your neighbor the danger of America misdiagnosing terrorism, violence, and injustice necessitates a moral revival. Micah chapter 2, and I won't read it in the Hebrew. I'll read it from the Message Bible, which is a translation. Says this, Micah chapter 2, verse 1, "Doom to those who plot evil, who go to bed dreaming up crimes. As soon as it is the morning, they are off, full of energy, doing what they had planned. They covet fields and grab them. They find homes and take them. They bully their neighbor and his family. They see people only for what they can get out of them. God has had enough. He says, I've got some plans of my own. Disaster because of this interbreeding evil. Your necks are on the line. You're not walking away from this. It's doomsday for you. Mocking ballads will be sung of you, and you yourselves will sing the blues. But you say, don't preach like that, preacher. Don't preach such stuff. Nothing bad will happen to us. Talk like this to the family of Jacob. Does God lose his temper? Is this the way he acts? Isn't he on the side of good people? Doesn't he help those who help themselves? What do you mean, good people? You're the enemy of my people. You rob unsuspecting people out for an evening stroll. You take their coats off their backs like soldiers who plunder the defenseless. You drive the women of my people out of their ample homes. You make victims of children and leave them vulnerable to violence and vice. Get out of here, the whole lot of you. You can't take it easy here. You've polluted this place, and now you're polluted and ruined. If someone showed up, however, with a good smile and a glib tongue and told lies from morning to night and told you, I'll preach the sermons that will tell you how you can get anything you want from God, more money, best wishes, you name it, you would hire them on the spot as your preacher. But I'm calling a meeting with Jacob. I want my prophets to call a meeting with my people. I want everybody back, all the survivors. I'll get them together in one place, like sheep in a fold, like cattle in a corral, a milling throng of homebound people. And then I, God, will burst all confinements and lead them out into the open. They will follow their king, because I, the Lord, will be out in front leading them. You know, the prophetic text of Judaism and the prophetic words of Jesus were among the favorite of Dr. King. The texts that challenge us to be and not to seem, the texts that let us know clearly that we can't ask God's grace and mercy on us on the one hand, but then leave undone the weightier matters of the law, love and justice and mercy in our political and public life on the other hand. For the prophets taught that to do so is hypocritical at best and heresy at worst. Dr. King often launched his words and his sermons from the prophetic text. Texts like Jeremiah 22, thus saith the Lord, do justice and righteousness and deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who has been robbed. Or Amos, let justice roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Dr. King often launched from these texts. Micah 6:8, he has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord doth require, that you do justice and love kindness and walk humbly before your God. Dr. King often launched his sermons from these texts, like Ezekiel, when it says, do justice and righteousness and deliver the one who has been robbed from the power of his oppressor. Or, enough, you princes of Israel, put away violence and destruction and practice justice and righteousness. Or Matthew 25, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? But I was drawn, Dr. Brown, to this specific text from Micah because, like others, it addresses something then that we must address today, and that is the danger of misdiagnosing your own problem. The people of Micah's day had misdiagnosed their problem. The terrorism and the violence and injustice around it, they were claiming it was because of one thing when actually it was because of another. Now this text, the context of it was amidst the increasing pressure and growing inequality because of the expanding Assyrian Empire. The people of Judah are talking about what I call TVI, that's a disease, TVI, terror, violence, and injustice. They're talking about it as something coming upon them from the outside, but the leaders have misdiagnosed the problem. Samaria, the prophet says, Micah, has been destroyed by God because of the crimes of idolatry, oppression of the poor, and misuse of power. In other words, the real enemy was not Assyria. Even Micah's village of Moresheth, as well as the others, Judah's second largest city. It is attacked. But Micah warns of coming disaster and the real problem. And in chapter 2, verse 1 through 5, he first denounces the appropriation of land and houses, which is a reference to the greed of the wealthy and the powerful, possibly resulting in the militarizing of the land of the poor to ensure if there is a battle, it is fought on the land of the poor and not that of the wealthy. The Bible writes, one commentary says, in this context, the cry introduces an indictment of those who lie awake at night devising new and creative ways, using the threat of terrorism and violence to steal the land and the home of the poor. and to carry out their covetous plans without restraint or oral compunction. In other words, the very ones calling others evil are the cause of the evil themselves. My good friend, the biblical scholar Liz Theo Harris, notes importantly that Micah's emphasis on plotting evil in their bed is an effort to emphasize the laziness and affluence of the rich and the powerful, and their plans to send everybody else to war while they lay around in their beds. She noted that in ancient Eastern society, most regular people would have not had any time for leisure or to spend in the bed. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, all of the statements condemning laziness and inertness are never focused on the poor, but on the rich. And then Micah renders one other diagnosis, and that is against the preachers and the false religionists, the so-called evangelicals of that day, who promoted a heretical interpretation of faith that simply sought to be the chaplain and the covering for the devices of the wicked by saying what they wanted to hear and not what they needed to hear. Micah begins quoting his opponents, commanding him not to preach negative and despairing words. And their argument that God is patient, God wouldn't say this, Micah. Judah has a certain exceptionalism, but Micah responds, you will hire that kind of preacher on the spot, but I ain't him. Micah concludes this section with a sarcastic comment. He said, you want somebody who will speak falsehood, who will not tell you what the real problems are. And then he says and concludes, God wants a meeting. God wants a revival, because that's the only place and the only way we can get this diagnosis straight. Now, Micah knew what we must know. Micah knew then what we must know now, that it is dangerous to misdiagnose terrorism, violence, and injustice. Like Micah, the legacy of Dr. King is one that refused to allow America to misdiagnose her real trouble and malady. That's the great gift of Dr. King. He would not allow us to live in self-deception. Vincent Hardin said this of Dr. King in one of the second or third publishings of Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. Vincent Hardin simply said Dr. King was free, prophetically free. On December 10th, 1967, a lot of people had told him he had done enough. You've done enough. Nobel Peace Prize, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65. Preachers, the president, were telling him, enough, just be cool. But Dr. King said on December 10th, 1967, something wrong. I'm worried about America. I'm worried about America. I'm worried about a country founded on the principles created equal by God, still wrestling with whether the color of skin determines the content of the character. This is 1967. I'm worried about a nation sick with militarism. I'm worried about a nation where at the time the gross national product was $800 billion and we still had 50 million poor people within the borders. He said something was wrong, and he knew that we couldn't talk about it wrong or misdiagnose it, which is why he announced the Poor People's March, to have a meeting, to cut through the deception and to show poverty from Appalachia to the cities to the countryside. You remember before that, on April 4th, 1967, Riverside Church, exactly 1 year to the date before his murder through an act of terrorism, he challenged America's misdiagnosing the Vietnam War. Now, we don't hear a lot about this in the media. You won't hear a lot about it over these 3 days, because the media and money attempt to reduce Dr. King to a human relations specialist rather than a prophet of God standing for human right, justice, and dignity. And this manipulation does not understand that you cannot have the dream of Dr. King, a radical prophetic dream, not a daydream, not a nursery rhyme dream, but a prophet's dream. You cannot have that kind of dream unless you are clear with your eyes wide open about the true nightmare existence of terrorism, racism, violence, and inequality. The kind of hope and dream of Dr. King is what Walter Brueggemann says, subversive imagination. It is the dangerous truth-telling that grows out of the determined desire to render the right diagnosis so that one can prescribe the right cure. What Dr. King's kind of dream, kind of hope, is the kind of hope that is the refusal to accept the reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. This kind of hope is subversive. It'll get you killed. For it limits the grandiose pretension of the present, daring to announce that the present to which we have all made commitments is now being called into question. And like Micah, the legacy of Dr. King is one that refuses to allow America to misdiagnose her real trouble and her real maladies. And we who are the heirs of Dr. King's vision can allow society to tame his dream. One writer noted last year in an article, MLK's radical vision got how MLK's radical vision got distorted. Jeff Gilbert, he wrote like this in Salon. He said, Dr. King implored the necessity for the nation to undergo a radical revolution of values. Say that, radical revolution of values. He explained that we must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. This is Dr. King preaching at Riverside. He said, when machines and computers and profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme militarism, and materialism are incapable of being conquered. 6 years before the troops withdrew from Vietnam, Dr. King called his government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He argued national investment in the war had already doomed President Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. He knew that people did not want to hear it, but he had to make sure that the diagnosis was rendered. He decried the coexistence of extreme wealth and poverty in American society. He said true compassion, in the same speech, is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that the edifice which produces beggars needs to be restructured. One day, Dr. King warned, we will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, South America, only to take the profits out with no consideration for the social betterment of this country. And that is not just. He said this in 67. He said, America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can lead to a revolution of value. But there is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from rendering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedent over the pursuit of war. Now, what happened after he talked like this? What happened? Oh, and he also, in almost every sermon from 67 to 68, told the story of Dives and Lazarus. The rich man that wouldn't help the poor man, both of them died. The rich man went to hell, the poor man went to heaven. And at the end of almost every sermon, Dr. King would say, and like Dives, America too will go to hell if she does not use her vast resources to lift up the poor and the hurting of this nation. What happened when he gave that diagnosis? Well, research tells us that after he rendered the right diagnosis, we know it was right because history has proven it to be right, that speech prompted President Johnson to revoke Dr. King's standing invitation to the White House. According to some reports, it also earned Dr. King denunciation from 168 newspapers the next day. A couple of them were black newspapers. Civil rights organizations, the NAACP and others walked away from him. Labor walked away from him. He became an unpopular figure despite that he organized the Poor People's Campaign. He had been fourth on the Gallup 1964 list of most admired men, and after that speech, he disappeared from the Gallup altogether. Don't you forget this legacy. Remember what the poet said, now that he is safely dead, let us praise him. Build monuments to his glory, sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes because they cannot rise to challenge the images we would fashion from their lives. And besides, it's easier to build a monument than to build a better world. Chris Fitzsimons says celebrations and ceremonies will be held across the state this weekend to commemorate the birthday of Dr. King as the official state holiday. He says, but Chris Feynman made a point. He says, if this year is like previous ones, most of the politicians will reduce King's message and life to one speech and one symbol and one dream that they will water down until it is almost sickening. Remember, Jesus said, woe unto you who love the tombs of the prophets, but not the prophets when they live. In fact, in the Jewish tradition, can I talk a little bit about Jewish tradition? In the Jewish tradition, when you touch the grave of a prophet, the spirit of that prophet is supposed to come upon you, and you emulate that prophet in life. That's why in the introduction to his work, The Prophets, Rabbi Heschel, God rest his soul, said the prophet was an individual who said no to his or her society, condemning its habits and assumptions, its complacencies, its waywardness, and the prophet's fundamental objective was to reconcile humanity and God. And we find, even in a cursory reading of the scripture, that God called forth prophets when the people had turned their backs on God and those living on the margins and living in poverty. So if we are to stand in the tradition of Dr. King, we can't allow America to misdiagnose our problems. And for the past few weeks, you've been watching it on the news. It's been filled with the pictures of death and killing coming out of California, a form of terrorism, violence, and injustice. The evil of taking life is vile. It's vicious. And we must pray for those families. We must pray for that kind of violence that's inspired by ISIS. But as we look at this and the response of many, I hear a call from Dr. King and our ancestor to use our influence to speak the truth in the midst of terror and challenge, and to challenge the misdiagnosis, because some are trying to pimp and prostitute the death in California for their own vicious political agendas. Some, like the host on a certain Sly as a Fox television station, used the death of those innocent people to push their terrorist and vile accusations, racist and fear-mongering agenda against the president and immigrants and Muslims. One of them said after the killing that the greatest threat to national security ever is President Obama. This is what they said, incapable psychologically and politically, who is not in the business of protecting Americans, but protecting Muslims. Muslims are American. Muslims are in our military. But this is the kind of language that Cornel West would call the niggerization of people. Yeah. When you got to find somebody to make them outside and other, or for certain people it's cynical and it's premeditated political agenda. It's using attacks on Muslims the same way in the racist past and sometime in the present, fear-mongering was used against black. And so this reveals, as my good friend Phyllis Bennis and I were discussing the other night, we don't have in America a Muslim problem or even a terrorism problem as much as we have a race problem. Let me push this, because I knew when I brought up that word y'all were going to get a little quiet. Let me push this further. Nothing is gained by pretending there aren't terrible things to be afraid of. Terrorism is real because millions of people live in terror, but we must be clear about the root of terror. We cannot misdiagnose the malignancy of terrorism. It is not Islam. It's not just forum. Terror has American export, and we cannot hide behind infallible notions of American exceptionalism to deny this. Even one of our nation hymns begs us, "Oh, beautiful for pilgrims sweet, whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare of freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, God mend thy every flaw. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty and law." Our misdiagnosis of terrorism and violence occurs when it is rooted in a heretical notion that some people don't matter as much as others. Now listen, we got to deal with the fact that the greatest terrorist act in history have American handprints all over them. The Middle Passage of slaves, Slavery, millions of them, thousands of millions dropped in the middle of the sea. Black human beings, 100 years of legalized Jim Crow, lynching, a series of race riots that killed thousands of black people from Springfield to Tulsa to Wilmington in the late 1890s and 1900s, church bombings, the assassination of Martin, Malcolm, Medgar, Viola, James Reeb, Harriet Moore. May I go on? American hands all over it. But also the Holocaust of Jews, that many in America held America back from early involvement, stopped us from getting involved because of claims of isolationism. Let's be clear about terrorism and violence and injustice. America cannot talk just about others. Yes, San Bernardino was terrorism, but so was Mother Emanuel. So was Mother Emanuel. Why didn't we use the same word there? So are the drone attack on civilian homes in Afghanistan. So is carpet bombing of cities. We must not forget that the key leaders of Daesh met and developed their agenda in the U.S.-run prison camp at Camp Boka in Iraq. When some in our country allow when Palestinian groups target children, as then we should be, in civilians, but say nothing when Israel does the same and refuses statehood to Palestinians. We got to talk real about terrorism. And let us not forget domestic terrorism, Timothy McVeigh, that too often has been called just a bombing. What about the shooting of Muslim students in Chapel Hill? What about rogue racist police shooting unarmed black adult teenagers and youth, male and female, in Chicago, Charlotte, New York? How about Tamir Rice and Jonathan Ferrell and nobody even being indicted so that those actions could be examined under the microscope of the courts? Terrorism, violence, injustice. Let's go further. Talking about terrorism and violence. Firearms kill over 30,000 people in the United States every year. And what does the NRA want? More guns. Guns would kill more Americans under 25 than cars in 2015. The American Academy of Pediatrics says that gun killings is now epidemic. And we've had 1,052 mass shootings in 1,066 days. Makes the president true when he gets up and says, we have a pattern now of mass shootings in this country that has no parallel anywhere else in the world. We live in a time where we are going to have to use our influence to challenge misguided misdiagnosis of violence and injustice. See, if violence means to hurt and to abuse needlessly, we must redefine how we talk about it. Our matriarch, Coretta Scott King, once said, poverty. She was asked one day, well, how do you feel about violence since your husband was assassinated? Ms. King said, well, that's a form of violence. But let me tell you something, she said, poverty can produce a most deadly kind of violence. In this society, she said, let me remind you, starving a child is violent. Suppressing a culture is violent. A discrimination against a working man is violent. Neglecting school children and denying them education is violent. Ignoring medical needs is violent. Contempt for equality is violent. And then she said, even a lack of willpower to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. So like Micah, like Martin, like Coretta, we must refuse to misdiagnose terrorism, violence, and injustice and have an honest conversation. Because the truth is, public policy can be violent. Otto Schwammer at MIT talks about the way we don't even hardly say the name poor is a form of attention violence. Being the wealthiest and the poorest country in the world at the same time is policy violence. Bailing countries out where the CEOs make 350 times their workers with tax monies and no interest while charging interest on college loans as children trying to go to school is a form of political violence. Breaking the back of unions so that working people will not have an advocate in the workplace is a form of political violence. Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the world, has put out in the book called The Price of Inequality. He said, in this country in year 2009, you had 400 Americans who took home an hourly wage of $97,000 an hour. While at the same time, we're in a country refusing to pay a living wage and then arresting people for fighting for 15. That's a political form of violence. 40% of all the workers in America make less than $15. 54% of them are black and people of color. 64 million people. 64 million people. That's a form of political violence. We have to have an honest conversation. Rising inequality breeds more inequality. There's a cost to it. When the Columbia School of Public Health can actually now detail empirically that 245,000 deaths happened in the year 2000 were attributable to poverty, more than strokes and cancer and heart attacks. Our military budget is as large as those of 8 countries combined, a number that accounts for more than 20% of the federal budget, $699 billion in 2011, while the spending on health, transportation, income security, education, training, employment, Social Security was only $341 billion in 11. 1% of the U.S. wealth holders have 39.8% of the country's wealth. 10% have 74%, which leaves the 90% of us fighting over the other 25%. It's a national and a moral disgrace, says Mary Wright Edelman, that there are 14.7 poor children in America and 6.5 million extremely poor children in the United States of America, the world's largest economy. And that 14.7 million children exceeds the population of 12 states in the United States. And we know, according to research, that just 2% of federal government money towards programs that work could eradicate almost 60% of that poverty. When you don't do it and you know what to do, that's a form of policy violence. When health care is being denied for 8 million people in 24 states because some people don't like a black man in the White House. I mean, what else? What could be the other reason? It can't be because the people are lazy, because most people on Medicaid expansion are working people and veterans. It can't be partisan because President Obama wasn't the first one to suggest health care. It was Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican. Most of the people that would benefit are white. In this state, 346,000 of the 500,000 being denied are white. Yes, 8 out of 10 blacks live in the states that are denying it, but the majority of the people are white. And we know that 30,000 people are dying every year because of the denial of Medicaid expansion. That's a form of policy violence. And then when you add to the notion of this notion, dollarocracy. As John Nichols talks about in his book, we're going to spend $10 billion in 2016. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says it like this. He describes the Citizen United ruling as ushering in the completion of a hostile takeover of our government. We got to have a real conversation about violence and injustice. We know that education is the key to life and liberty. You believe that? Education is the key, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, once said that not to fund public education was to undermine national security. Of course, he was challenged by Freddie Koch, the daddy of David and Charles Koch. Where are we now? 60 years? 60 years. What was it counted? 60 years? 54 was it? Brown versus Board of Education decision. Was that right? 54? Here we are, 61 years later, and high poverty resegregated schools are growing faster than they were in the 1970s. That's policy violence. Privatizing school with public money, policy violence. Funding schools with property tax formula. Cutting education funding, refusing to fully fund it, cuts the heart out of our economy, but also the heart out of our future. Attacking teachers relentless and being willing to pay teachers a little bit and pay coaches that put balls through goals in college millions and millions of dollars. That's the kind of policy violence. New restrictions on the use of race-based affirmative action in higher education. If we're going to talk about violence and injustice, we got to talk about policy violence, like Micah and like Martin and like Coretta. Look at our criminal justice system. One book says, in Punishment and Inequality in America, a sociologist says that prison is the dominant and most formative institution in the lives of poor black men in the United States. Now, with the percentage of African American men compared to the percentage of people in this country, you either have to believe that somehow black people are inherently immoral, which is the reason for the graphic numbers of the graphic differences, or something's wrong in the system. When the NAACP can write a report and the title of the report is Born Suspect, when you are at risk of being shot, at risk of getting an arrest, and at risk for ending up having to take a plea bargain for something you didn't even do. That's a form of policy violence. When Michelle Alexander can call it the new Jim Crow and be right. When James Cone can call it the lynching tree as a description of the prison industrial complex and be right. When the U.S. has 5% of the world population, but 25% of the world's prisoners, and over 1.5 million of those are African Americans or Latinos, and African Americans are incarcerated at a rate nearly 6 times the rate of whites, we gotta have a conversation about policy violence. We gotta have a conversation about it when we look at voting rights. The Supreme Court did. They gutted Section 4, which nullified Section 5. Boehner, Ryan, McConnell have had a 2-year filibuster. They won't even bring up a vote to fix the Voting Rights Act Amendment. Not one vote, just to vote on it. Attacks on voting rights have gone on all over the country. Right here in our own state, once the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby, one of our legislators said, now that the headache has been removed. Said that in the earshot of the media. And when you attack voting rights that come after blood and sacrifice, that is a form of political violence. 24 states have extreme voter suppression. The first time you heard the rabbi in 50, think about this, we have less voting rights today than they had August 6, 1965. Loretta Lynch has less power today as an attorney general because of the nullification of the voting right than the attorney general had in 1965. And now, in addition to that, the Supreme Court is taking up a case to change the one person, one vote principle. They've actually agreed, Judge Fry, to hear the case of whether or not we need to move away. And if it was to happen, African Americans would lose 20% of their representation. Latinos would lose over 50%. We gotta have a conversation about real violence. When politicians say only black death matters, that's what they say. That's what Nikki Haley said in essence. You didn't hear? She said, I'm taking this flag down because of the lives that were lost at Emmanuel. Now wait a minute. The NAACP had a 20-year boycott. Asked you to take it down, and you didn't take it down. But as soon as 9 people die, you're gonna take the flag down? Do you really understand what you're saying? That only black death matters? And then you're gonna take the flag down, but the Emmanuel 9, they were fighting for living wages, they were fighting for voting rights, they were fighting for Medicaid expansion. So you're going to take the flag down, but you're not going to vote living wages up. You're not going to vote Medicaid expansion up. You're not going to vote more money for education up. So you're really saying that even when black lives die, the way you honor it is to take down a flag that should have never been up in the first place. That's a form of violence and psychological terrorism. When politicians are doing what George Wallace did in 1968 and getting away with it, and you know, like I know, if President Obama had said just 1 or 2 of the things that these folk are saying, he'd have been run out of the country. You remember, you know what I'm talking about. You remember Lee Atwater, when he described the Southern strategy? He said, you start out in 1954 saying N-word, N-word, N-word. But in 1968, you can't say N-word, so you start saying stuff like force busing and states' rights and law and order. You become very abstract. You talk about tax cuts. Now, these things sound totally economic, but the byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites blame their problem on black, and you end up dividing the country. It's called the Southern strategy, and it has its own lexicon. And if you don't know the lexicon, you will not know that people are being racist right in front of your face. He went on to say the goal of the Southern strategy. He said this. He said the goal of the Southern strategy is all of the old Confederacy, with the goal of developing a solid South that will ensure the majority of Southern whites resist and repel any fusion political alliances with African America and thereby hold back the rest of the nation. And when that kind of stuff is going on right in our face, that's a form of political violence. When so many people claim not to be racist, but in a book entitled Racism Without Races, Glenn Lowry says, in almost every observable measure, the well-being, wages, unemployment, wealth levels, prison enrollment, mortality statistic, brown and black people lead it. He said, people say there are no racists today. Only the willful deaf cannot hear the dog whistle politics of race. What do you think it is when you call the president a food stamp president? What is it when you call him a lie? Not a liar, but a lie on the floor of the Congress. What is it that when you get up at a debate and call him a petulant child? When folk are using that kind of language, and you know that if President Obama had ever used these words, he would have been called an arrogant radical, and I cannot say the rest of it in here. We have to have a real talk about political violence, because the truth is, my friends, we have an extreme agenda afoot in America that ought, like Dr. King, worry us. They're telling us the road to a great America is cut public education, deny health care, deny unemployment, deny earned income tax credit, deny equal rights to immigrants and gay citizens, challenge the president on everything, refuse to even support what is good for America, be willing to go to war rather than to negotiate, deny and abridge voting rights, distort religious beliefs, and then after you have done all of this to divide people, and even after the massacre and the terrorist act in Charleston and in San Bernardino, after all of that, make sure everybody can get a gun easier than they can vote. That's the agenda they're selling. And in times like these, we need a meeting. Micah said you got to have a meeting. Some things have to transcend political majorities and mere majority politics. Some things we have to challenge because they're wrong. They're extreme and they're immoral. So if we're going to be great as a nation, we can't afford this misdiagnosis. The danger of misdiagnosing is we see the enemy without and we don't see the enemy within. And so Micah said to Judah, God says it's time to have a meeting, a revival meeting, a holy convocation meeting, a meeting of the soul and the mind, and we need a meeting today. And in this meeting, we must dare, like the prophets, to connect love and justice. In this meeting, we got to preach in the pulpits and in the public square. In this meeting, we got to challenge the moral hypocrisy, because that's the only antidote. It's called truth-telling serum. Lord have mercy. That's the only thing that can help you when things have been misdiagnosed. A revival. We need a revival of moral values, a value that names violence in all of its form. We need a revival. And Nelson, at this meeting, we need to demand the right agenda. We need to say, America, North Carolina, healing is available. Cure is available. But if you want it to work, if you want healing to come, number one, you've got to secure pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that ensure economic sustainability by fighting for full employment, living wages, the alleviation of disparate unemployment, a green economy, labor rights, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zone, strong safety net services for the poor, fair policies for immigrants, critiquing war policies that further disable our ability to have a real war on poverty, infrastructure development, and fair tax reform. Healing is available, but you got to have education equality by ensuring that every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education, as well as access to community colleges and universities. Yes, healing is available, but you've got to have health care for all by starting with assuring access to the Affordable Care Act and Medicare and Medicaid, but then getting the universal health care where everybody is covered, and protecting Social Security and environmental protection. Yes? Healing is available, but you got to have fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities in the system that impact black, brown, and poor white people. Yes, healing is available, but at the meeting, we've got to demand that we protect and expand voting rights and women's rights and LGBT rights and immigrants' rights, and we never give up on the fundamental principle of equal protection under the law. And at this meeting, we've got to decide that the soul of our nation is worth saving. At this meeting, we've got to decide that we will fully participate in our democracy, and we will tell people of conscience, vote. I don't care if they lie to you, vote. I don't care what the Tea Party does, vote. I don't care how many people try to stop the right to vote. Too many people died, too many people cried, too many people bled. Vote. Let's have a meeting at the ballot box. And then in this meeting, we got to fuse the energy of all of our movement. God says have a meeting. In other words, come together and focus again on my purposes. And God says if you come together and have a meeting, then I'll guide you and I'll lead you. The prophets had a meeting. We need a meeting. The first Reconstruction, there was a meeting. Changed this nation. Second Reconstruction, civil rights movement was a meeting, changed this nation. We need a third Reconstruction. We need a third awakening, a third national revival. We need a meeting of the heart and a meeting of the mind. We need a revolution of values meeting. We need a meeting where something can start running from heart to heart and from breast to breast. Because the greatest myth of our time is that these policies only hurt a small group of us, but in fact they hurt others. And I'm telling you, I know the power of having a meeting. I know the power of coming together. Can I preach a little bit in this Jewish house? I know it biblically. I know the power of coming together because when Moses and his people and his rod had a meeting, God moved. Pharaoh came down and the Red Sea opened up. When Esther and her uncle Mordecai had a meeting and came together, they were able to stop the plots of destruction against the Jewish people. When David and his rock and his slingshot and his faith had a meeting, came together on the battlefield. Goliath fell, and the next day the paper read, the bigger they come, the harder they fall. Yeah, I know y'all didn't know that you had some Jewish black folk, but when Shadrach, Meshach, and that bad Negro came together, when they came together and had a meeting, way down in the fiery furnace, God came and cooled the fire down. Somebody said they saw a fourth person and it looked like the Son of God. Can I get a witness here? When the church had a meeting in the upper room, the Bible said the winds blew and the tongues of fire came and God moved. I know the power of having a meeting. I know the power of staying together biblically, but I also know it historically. The truth is when you hold on to truth and when you hold on to hope and you hold on to justice, justice has never lost. Might get beat up, but it's never lost. During slavery, it looked like justice had lost, but when Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and some Quakers and white evangelicals and William Lloyd Garrison and Henry Thoreau had a meeting, they got together and formed the fusion movement, and it brought about abolition. Women didn't have the right to vote, but when Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Canton State had a meeting and they got together, they won the right to vote. Plessy versus Ferguson looked like it had the victory forever, but when Thurgood Marshall got white lawyers and black lawyers and Jewish lawyers and they had a meeting, an all-white Supreme Court with one member who had been a member of the KKK voted unanimously to tear down separate but equal. It looked like Jim Crow had beaten down injustice and could not rise again, but it didn't count on Rosa Parks and Martin King and Rabbi Heschel and Roy Wilkins and Ella Baker and Snick and Bayard Rustin having a meeting. But when they did, they brought Jim Crow down. In South Africa, it looked like it would be apartheid forever. But when Bishop Tutu and Nelson Mandela had a meeting, they were unable to unravel apartheid. So I know biblically the power of coming together. I know historically the power of coming together. But let me close here by telling you it's not just biblical for me. It's not just historical for me. It's personal for me. Some years ago, Sister Carolyn, remember, some of people said I might never walk again. They said I might never get out of a wheelchair. I was 30 years old. I had always depended on my legs, but I woke up one morning and I couldn't move, and I spent nearly 3 months in a bed in a hospital not knowing if I would ever get up and walk again. For 12 years, I got after the hospital, I was in a wheelchair and on a walker, and every time I stood behind a pulpit like this, felt like somebody had a butcher knife in my hip. I had to lean on my walker in order to talk. But over those 12 years, there was a meeting. Somehow, my mind got together, and then my doctors got together. My swim coach and my therapist and my nutritionist got together. The prayer warriors in my church got together. My family got together. Then the Holy Ghost got together with my faith. I can run now. I can march now. Yeah. And I'm here to tell you, if we come together, weeping may endure for a night, but joy will come in the morning. If we come together, One can chase 1,000 and two can put 10,000 to flight. If we come together, if my people who are called by my name will turn from their evil ways and seek my face and turn to God, then will I hear their land. God will guide us. Do you believe it?
Yes, sir.
I know tonight that if Moral Monday hands join the hands of Black Lives Matter, and they join the hand of Fight for 15, and then they meet together with Latinos, and then they join the hands of progressive whites, and then they meet with labor hands, and they meet with Asian hands, and they meet with Native American hands, and then they hook up with poor hands, and they then hook up with wealthy hands that have a conscience, and then they join the gay hands, and they join the straight hand, and then they hook up the Jewish hand, and they hook up the Muslim hand, and they hook up the Christian hand. I know together we can heal this nation. Together, we can ensure that all children are respected. Together, we can redeem the heart of America and make sure that this nation lives out its promise. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Together, when we all have a meeting, when we all get together, 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 what a day! What a day! What a day! What a day! What a day of rejoicing! Go ahead.